Has anyone else kind of got a case of the amazing readathon slumps? Hi, welcome, come on in. My name is Aoife and today I am going to wrap up my July reading for you. June was such a big reading month for me. I read well over 20 books, which I haven't done in such a long time. I think I actually haven't read over 20 books since last year's amazing readathon. That July just was a slump month for me. I only read 6 books across the entire month of July, which is kind of my average, but I was hoping that I would kind of ride the wave a little bit and up that a little bit more over the month. As I said, I read 6 books across July and I DNF'd a further 3 of them. All 6 of the books that I read across the month were catered to an adult audience. I read 3 ebooks, 1 physical book and 2 audiobooks for a total of 1,437 pages and 21 hours of listening time. For the genres, 3 were a romance book, 2 were more so a contemporary book, whereas 1 was a historical fiction. And I gave 1 book 4.5 stars, 2 books got 4 stars, another 2 books got a 3.5 star, and 1 book was rated a 3 star. As per usual, let's start with the DNFs. The first book that I DNF'd across July was Guilty by Definition by Susie Dent. I was genuinely really looking forward to this one. It was written by the woman who is the lexicographer on Countdown, which is a really popular show in the UK. It's shown at about 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and it's kind of a quiz show where you get 9 random letters from which you have to make the longest word that you can. There's also the conundrum at the end of the show, which is 9 letters all jumbled up that are actually one word. And there's also a numbers round in that, which, as you can imagine, is not necessarily my forte. I absolutely love Countdown, but I think I specifically prefer 8 out of 10 Cats Does Countdown, which is more so on a comedy version. They have comedians on. They also still have Susie Dent, and they have the resident mathematician that comes on. But it's a little bit less serious. It's much more chill vibes, and it's much more my kind of vibe. So, when I had heard that Susie was bringing out a book, I instantly wanted to read it, and I got a copy of it from NetGalley, but it just did not work for me. I gave it about 10% before I left it to the side, and the main reason for this is that it felt too intelligent for me. Guilty by Definition follows Martha, who is an editor for the Clarendon English Dictionary, and they like to kind of do word puzzles to figure out what the next word of the year is going to be, or they like to figure out kind of words that should be included in the dictionary but haven't been, or they can be taken out of the dictionary because they haven't been used in so long. One day, Martha and her editors are sent a letter in the post which kind of relates to Martha's story a lot more than anyone else's. It has got some secrets and some information about her sister Charlie, who went missing about 10 years previously. Martha decides that she's going to take these letters and she's going to figure out all of the clues and find out finally what it was that happened to her older sister. Problem is that sounded like such a great idea, and the whole concept of this book sounded really entertaining. It's just that it used such big and superfluous words for things that it really didn't need to use them for. It made the dialogue sound really clunky and unnatural. These are just things that a 30-year-old wouldn't normally say. I don't know a 30-year-old who would even use curmudgeon on a daily basis. There was just so much of this book that I think I had hoped a little bit better for, and it just didn't deliver. My next DNF in August was Love in the Time of Serial Killers by Alicia Thompson. I was really looking forward to this because I felt like it would be kind of a mixture of a romance book and a thriller. And those are 2 genres that I really love reading, so I thought it would be like the perfect marriage for me in a book. I just was a little bit disappointed by it. This book follows Phoebe, who has moved to her father's house after he's passed away to basically clean everything up and get it ready to be sold on. While she's there, she connects with her younger brother Connor, who comes in and tells her that he is about to propose to his partner, but she also meets Sam, who lives next door, and she instantly has her hackles up about him. He goes into his garage quite a lot late in the evenings and then comes out with what looks like dark and sticky material on his hands that takes a really long time for him to wipe off. Or there are always really loud bangs and crashes coming from his house next door. Phoebe is a huge lover of true crime, and she's actually writing a PhD based on true crime and its portrayal in the media. So there's quite a lot of references to true crime throughout this book. You can almost see that this is overtaking her life, pretty much to the point of an obsession. everything in her life has to be somehow connected to true crime, particularly because she is convinced that Sam is a serial killer. And that was when it got too much for me. It was so farcical, and it was so kind of trying to stretch every situation to make it fit into this narrative that she had put into her head. For example, she was hearing a lot of crashing, she was hearing a lot of loud noises, when it turned out he was just having a retirement party for one of his co-workers. I did give this a good stab, no pun intended. I think I got to about the 60 or so page mark, but I just could not get on board with it. Being inside Phoebe's head the entire time is exhausting. She is completely farcical. She will take every situation and run 7 miles with it. And by the end of the time that I spent with this book, I was just a little bit exhausted from having been in her head all the time. My third DNF in July was Come and Get It by Kylie Reid, and I was truly disappointed by this one. I had read Such a Fun Age back in June of 2020, and I had a phenomenal time with it. I vividly remember sitting on the couch and being so engrossed by it that my phone had been going off for about 20 minutes, not with anything important, it was just a couple of WhatsApps, and I missed every single one of them. This wasn't the experience that I had in this book, though. This is following Millie and Agatha. Millie is a residence assistant at the University of Alabama, and Agatha has come as a kind of a visiting professor to the university. That's kind of all I can remember about this book. It seems like there's a whole lot of characters in here that you meet, and that you're kind of given flashbacks about their lives and what they're doing on a regular basis and what they were doing today. And I feel like, honestly, it just wasn't easy to tell when it was a flashback and when it was the present day, and who was talking and who wasn't the main character in this situation. It felt a whole lot of everything is happening but nothing is happening, and when that happens in a book, it just doesn't grasp me in. I actually listened to the audiobook of this, and I was putting laundry out on the line while I was listening to it, and I kind of remember thinking, I don't know what's happened in this book. I feel like I need to go back and figure out what it was that I've missed, because I haven't actually taken anything in from this book. When I had gone back, I didn't really remember anything that had been happening, but I also found that I wasn't particularly looking to find out what had been happening. So when that's happening with a book, when I'm not that invested in it already early doors, it's just time to say goodbye. Onto the books that I actually did read in July, and the first book that I read was Love Me Do by Lindsay Kelk. I was super looking forward to this one, and it actually lay on my shelves for over a year by the time I had picked it up. I used to be the kind of person who would instantly run out, buy a book by Lindsay Kelk, and then read it almost the second that I had gotten home. This one just took me a little bit longer to get to. This book is following Phoebe, who goes out to the US to spend a couple of weeks with her sister, who has been living in LA for a really, really long time. It turns out, however, that her sister Suzanne is being brought up to Washington so that she can work on an app that her company is developing, which leaves Phoebe lying alone in the house for about 3 weeks, the entirety of her trip. While Phoebe is there, she gets to know her neighbor Wren, and she also gets to know Suzanne's personal trainer Belle. Belle, as it turns out, has had a massive crush on Wren ever since she met him. Being a greetings card writer and being super versed in what to say to get people's attention, Phoebe decides that she is going to kind of matchmake for Belle and Wren. The problem is that Phoebe and Wren are also starting to get to know each other. They're starting to get a little bit closer, and sparks are starting to fly between the two of them that aren't particularly there between Belle and Wren. There were a couple of things about this book that kind of took me back. The first thing that I'm going to note is that there is an entire subplot in this book that just feels like it was lifted from Evelyn Hugo. There is a recluse Hollywood star who has been living on her own for years and has turned into quite a stubborn old woman. She doesn't leave her home, she doesn't go out and talk to people. Nobody will come to the house, not even the postman. So all of her mail actually goes to Suzanne. And Phoebe then is tasked with bringing the mail over and then kind of chucks away at some of the ice that has been building up. I felt like this was a little bit too close to Evelyn Hugo for me to get on board with it. Something else that I really didn't get on board with, though, is the entire character of Belle. The whole way through this book, Belle annoyed me in that kind of overly energetic LA personality that a lot of people will know from film and TV. She was written in the perfect caricature of that, so much so that I almost took an instant dislike to her that just never lifted throughout the entire book. Something, however, that particularly didn't warm her to me is the 180 in personality from when she's talking to Suzanne and when she's talking to Phoebe and when she is talking to Ren. It's almost like she regresses to a toddler. She forgets her words. She forgets where she is. She is completely tongue-tied. And I know how it is. I know that when you are faced with the person that you've had a massive crush on for years, you do forget who you are and you do forget a whole lot of things. But this woman basically turned into a different person. And I just couldn't marry those two ideas. Something else that irritates me, and it's not just this book, there are a couple of others that I've seen, is when the author is English, when the characters are English. Okay, in this situation, it was not set in the UK, but there would be a kind of an expectation of this that it's not written using British English. It is written using American English, but weirdly, a combination of the two. So you will see colour or favour or neighbour written with the U, and then a couple of sentences later you will see realise or recognise or organise written with a Z. If you're going to pick one, pick one. If you're going to pick the other, but be consistent and don't back and forth and chop and change. It just irritates me so much. Can you tell that in my daily life I work as a sub-editor? It also felt to me like the ending was just tied up a little bit too neatly. Every conflict that came up in this book was solved within maximum 5 pages. And there was no conflict that was ever really that serious. I also felt like at the end of it, everyone was like, oh, Phoebe, I don't want you to go back to the UK. I don't want you to leave here. I've had a great time with you. And that's understandable. When somebody comes to your country or your town and you get to know them for such a short time, you don't want them to go back home and you want to keep fostering that relationship that you've started with them. But it felt like the outcome of that was just way too easily tied up with a neat little bow in order to give everybody the happy ending that this story needed. It just didn't feel realistic to me, and it did really feel like, oh, I'm just going to shoehorn this in just so that this has the little happy ending that every book should have. It just didn't work for me here. Then I read Role Playing by Kathy Yardley, and I had one of the best times I've had this month with this book. I know so many people who read this as part of the Amazing Readathon because Heather had it as one of her host's favourites, and to be honest, I think I should have read it across then as well. I first started this when I was on the plane back to Berlin, having spent the entire week before with my family back at home in Ireland. And I am so glad that that is when I started it because I had so much time to just switch off. Didn't have to think about what was on my phone. Didn't have to think about anything else. I could just head down straight into the book. This book is about Maggie and Aidan, or as they would have initially known each other, Bog, Witch and Otter. They meet each other when they are in a chat room for an RPG game that they are playing together. They've been put in the same kind of coven together, and they have no idea who the other person is in real life. They actually think that they are of completely separate ages than they are. Aidan thinks that Maggie is in maybe her 80s, whereas Maggie thinks that Aidan is somebody around her son's age, maybe a couple of years older, so like 18 to 21. What actually happens is that there's maybe about 2 or 3 years between Aidan and Maggie. Aidan is just in his early 50s and Maggie is about 47 or 48. That was something that I absolutely adored about this book. You are watching older characters who you don't really see a lot of in books, not particularly the books that I have been reading, but I absolutely loved watching this kind of later in life romance, almost like a second chance romance for both of them, second chance at the game. I absolutely loved it. Aidan and Maggie also have their own separate difficulties to deal with outside of the game, but they really find solace in one another. Sometimes they will even go into the chat room and will play a couple of hours while the others aren't online at all. Maggie is suffering a little bit of empty nest syndrome. She's been divorced for a couple of years and now her son Kit has moved out and he's headed to college a little bit across the country. Aidan has been living in New York for years but has come back to their small town in Washington to care for his elderly mother following the death of his father. She's not particularly got all of her faculties with her. She probably shouldn't be behind the wheel of a car as an absolute minimum. And Aidan, having worked as a hospice worker, is pretty sure what the signs he's seeing are telling him. But like most stubborn mothers that you would know, there is absolutely zero talking to her. What makes this a little bit more complicated is that Aidan's former wife, Cheryl, is now married to his own brother. I found that to be, first of all, a little bit of a headfuck, and I don't know how I would react if that was the situation I was in real life. But it does come up quite a bit later on in the book in a very specific way. Aidan and Maggie are talking about their relationships previously and their sexualities, and Aidan divulges to Maggie that he had been in a relationship with another man while he was in college, but had never particularly put a label on his own sexuality. As he and Maggie kind of soul search and deep dive a little bit further, Aidan finds out about the label demisexuality, and that is by far one of my favourite scenes in the entire book. This whole world opening up to him and kind of coming to terms with who he is and feeling comfortable about putting a label onto what he might be, and then coming to talk to other people in his life about it. I know how terrifying it can be, and I know how vulnerable it makes you feel when you're laying out all of that about yourself in front of people who you don't always know how their reaction is going to go. I absolutely loved it. You can see just how much trust they had in one another. You can see the respect that they had for one another. And you can also see it again later when Maggie meets Cheryl for the first time. It turns out that Cheryl and Aidan stopped dating one another as Cheryl had found out about Jordan and was living under the assumption for a very long time that Jordan had been a woman. But when she finds out that Aidan had been in a relationship with another man, she goes running for the hills. Maggie, of course, is not the kind of person to take that lying down, and instantly, the second that she meets Cheryl, starts it up. I absolutely loved that scene. It includes the iconic line, "Hold my earrings." As soon as I read that line, I was all in. I absolutely loved this book. There is so much to love about it. I could sit here and talk about it for about half an hour, but I think we all have other things to do for the day. I absolutely loved this book. This is the first of Kathy Yardley books that I've ever read, but I am definitely going to go and check out her back catalogue now. The next book that I read was Every Summer After by Carly Fortune. I was kind of influenced to read this. I had seen Brittany and some of her Patreons had been reading Meet Me at the Lake, but I wanted to start right at the beginning. I knew that this wasn't a series, so I could have read any of the books out of order, but I had wanted to see how Carly's writing would work for me, and I'd put it on my summer TBR for the year. The first question that I asked myself in my reading journal was spicy, ? And I am happy to report it's pretty spicy. It's maybe like a 3 on my personal chilies range, which is open door, but not explicit open door. This book follows Persephone, or Percy, and Charlie and Sam, who had met each other when their cottages were right beside each other in Barry's Bay in Canada. Percy's family had bought a summer cabin, and Charlie and Sam are brothers who had been living in the area year-round. Their mother owned a tavern in the community, which served a lot of Polish food to honour her Polish heritage, and I absolutely loved that aspect of it because you saw all 3 of the teenagers really helping out. Percy would sometimes just have landed in Barry Bay and then head over to the taverna and see if there was any jobs that needed to be done. Was the floor super busy so she could go into the kitchens, or was everything getting a little bit chaotic in the front of house so she maybe needed to go and serve some tables? I really loved seeing that because it brought me screaming back to my own summer job when I was a teenager working in a local restaurant, and I know just how chaotic and just how stressful that can be. So it really gave me kind of Vietnam War style flashbacks, but also really good flashbacks at the same time. Percy and Sam are inseparable. They are absolute best friends from the second that they've met each other, and they kind of push each other to go the distance and do everything that they've wanted to do. Percy absolutely champions Sam's dreams of being a doctor, whereas Sam is the first person that Percy will show her writing to, and he is also 100% behind her when she says that she wants to spend one summer training so that she can swim the entirety of the lake one day. As we get to the current timeline of the book, Percy and Sam have been out of contact with each other for about 6 or 7 years. But Percy has gotten a phone call from Charlie one day to say that Charlie and Sam's mother has passed away. She is invited back to Barry Bay for the funeral and to be with the family because their mother had such an impact on her when she was a teenager and she just felt like one of the family. The timeline jumps between now and a timeline about 13 or 14 summers ago when you see Percy and Sam's friendship develop into a relationship. You see relationships and friendships that there had been with separate people in the town. You see a lot of Percy's friends from back home in Toronto. You see her relationship with her parents. And I thought it was such a great way of telling the story. This actually has a quite similar storyline to Love and Other Words by Christina Lauren. So if you've read that book, you'll be kind of familiar with what happens here. But I actually thought it was done better here. Okay, it did include a cheating trope, which is not my kind of thing. But overall, I had such a great time with this book. I felt like it was written really well and the writing really flowed. There was also the kind of perfect amount of conflict for me throughout this book. Not just conflict between Percy and Sam, but also between Percy and Charlie. There were a couple of times that they really went at loggerheads with one another. But also with Percy and her sometimes best friend, sometimes worst enemy, Delilah. I found myself wanting less and less to read about Delilah, but also becoming more and more intrigued as to why it was that when we are in the present timeline, Delilah is no longer in Percy's life. I really wanted to know what was the reason for that. Was there like a big, massive blowout that they had a screaming match with one another, or did time just catch up with them and adulthood catch up with them and they just lost contact? I think the resolution of that and what actually caused it, it wasn't necessarily what I was expecting it to be, but it was still pretty well written and it was very realistic as to what the two girls' personalities would have been at the time and what life would have been like at the time. A question that I have about this book, and I haven't seemed to gotten any answers, there's not a whole lot of mention of Percy's parents in the present timeline. There's quite a lot of heavy topics with them in the past where they seemed to be very protective of their only child who they'd had quite late in life. It kind of gave me pause to think maybe Percy is in a no contact or a low contact state with her parents. I know that for a lot of the book, they had said that they had been on a cruise or they had been on a kind of a sabbatical, but I felt like there just wasn't any time where she was keeping in contact with them. She wasn't calling them on a Saturday evening and asking how their cruise was going and telling them that she had to go back to Barry Bay. It just felt like maybe their relationship had gotten a little bit strained over time, and now we were seeing the effects of that. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. I think it was a really great introduction to Carly Fortune's writing for me, and she's definitely an author that I'm going to keep going on with. I have got copies of her next two books. I've got one that I bought myself, and I have got one that I got from NetGalley, so I'm super excited to dive into those. The next book that I read in July was Blue Sisters by Coco Miller. This is the first book of Coco Miller that I read, and I actually picked this one up because it was what my in-person book club in Berlin was doing for the month. I didn't get to join them this month, so I didn't get to hear anybody else's thoughts, but I can still share with you some of mine. This book follows the four Blue sisters, Avery, Bonnie, Nikki, and Lucky. Avery used to live a kind of a high-octane life. She was very much the rebellious older daughter. She had moved out to LA and was hooked on heroin for a really long time, but is actually living in London now and has completely cleaned up her act and is now working as a very highly strung lawyer. Bonnie has been a boxer since she was about 14 or 15, and she has just retired, having lost a huge fight and been pulled out of the ring by her trainer. Lucky is a model and has been seen on the catwalks of Paris and of Milan, but her life is also starting to spiral downward, where she's finding out that a lot of the friendships that she had were very surface level and she didn't really have anybody that she could turn to. As for Nikki, she has actually passed away about a year before the book had started. Nikki had suffered with endometriosis for quite a lot of her life, and her death was an accidental overdose of the pain medication that she had been given to manage her condition. You see all three of her remaining sisters really coming to terms with her death It's set around the first anniversary of Nikki's passing, and you can truly see how much this has had an impact on them. Lucky, for example, feels a little bit bereft without her sister, as Nikki was her closest confidant of her three sisters. She was the one that she would turn to if she was having trouble, and she was always the one that was at the other end of the phone. You're actually told throughout this book that this is the first time that the sisters have actually been together because they've been rather estranged from one another. I have to say that I didn't necessarily get that vibe. It did feel a little bit like they were stilted and that they were cold to one another, but it didn't also necessarily seem that they had pushed each other out of their lives or that they just didn't want to interact with one another. It did give the feeling of when Lucky turned up at Avery's front door, she was very much welcome into Avery's home and she was welcome to fit into Avery's lifestyle as best as she could. Something that really struck me, and I may be the only person who has made this connection, is that I found similarities with all four of the Blue sisters to all four of the March sisters, specifically in where they fell in the timeline. Nikki, obviously, is your Beth character who falls sick quite early in the book and who loses their life. Lucky is the Amy, the very much doted upon by society, in this case, the beautiful one, the one who is envied by everybody, and kind of the one who causes the most chaos. In terms of manliness, Jo was always seen as kind of the tomboy of the four sisters, whereas Bonnie works in what is very much a male-dominated line. Bonnie works as a bouncer for a well-established nightclub in New York City, and she's one of the few female bouncers in the city, and you always get this impression that the other bouncers on the door feel that they have some sort of protective influence against her. I did feel like the connection between Meg March and Avery Blue was the weakest of the four, but you could still kind of see it. There was a big discussion throughout this book about whether or not Avery was ready to have a child with her wife Chidi, and that's quite a big source of conflict for the two of them throughout this book, whereas if you look at Meg March, basically all she wants to do is get married, settle down, and keep popping kids out. I did feel like this is where the connection was the weakest, but once I started seeing similarities between all 8 of those characters, it just was really hard to turn it off in my brain. This book is beautifully written. It does really make me want to reach for Cleopatra and Frankenstein, which is also on the shelves behind me. But there were also a couple of clunky moments. This book also kind of suffers from everything happening all at once syndrome, in that it just felt like every character was going through about 20,000 things at one time. And I feel like there could have been a little bit of a gentler treatment given to even just one of the sisters to make life a little bit easier for them and for the reader. It felt like everything that could happen was going to happen. There was so much self-destruction in this book as well that it made it really difficult for me to try and even root for one of the sisters. Quite early on, I remember thinking to myself, I don't know if any of these are going to be my favorite sister. I don't know who I would even pick. When you have an ensemble cast that you can't even pick out a favorite from, not quite the direction you want to go in. But I would definitely read a lot more of Coco Meller's work, and I am so excited to see what else she's going to bring out. Next up, I read Long Island by Colm Tóibín. I was so looking forward to this. This is the follow-up to Brooklyn, which follows Eilish Lacey, a young woman from County Wexford, who moves over to New York in search of a better lifestyle for herself. This book takes place about 20 years after the events of Brooklyn. Eilish and Tony are now married and they have 2 teenage children, Rosella and Larry. One day, a young man turns up at the Fiorelli household and tells Eilish that Tony has been having an affair with his wife and that his wife is pregnant with Tony's child. When the baby is born, he wants nothing to do with this baby and he's going to drop it on Eilish's front door. Do with that whatever she chooses. When she confronts Tony, he and her mother-in-law tell her that this is completely fine and that they are going to raise the child as their own. Eilish figures out that an Italian mother will never see any problems with what her child has ever done, especially if it is one of her sons. So she decides that while she is deciding what she needs to do with her life, she's going to go back to Ireland. She does this under the pretense that it's her mother's 80th birthday at the end of the month and she wants to spend some time with her family, having not seen them for about 20 years. Her 2 children are also going to come over and meet their grandmother and meet all of the people in Wexford for the first time. And I thought that you really see the difference in Eilish and the people of Enniscorthy when she comes back over. Eilish is a lot more sophisticated, she is a lot more put together than everyone who is back at home. And even though this is set in the 1970s, you can still see the huge kind of social shame that a lot of people felt in Ireland. There is quite a lot of stigma placed on Nancy, for example, who is a widow, has 2 adult grown up daughters, and is now contemplating marriage to a local bachelor, Jim Farrell. If you recognise that name, that is because Jim and Eilish actually had a little dalliance of themselves while Eilish was back over in Wexford before she had actually told people that she was already married to a man back in New York. After she had gone back to New York, there was no contact between her and Jim, so she has no idea that Jim and Nancy are even going out with one another. I feel like there was a whole lot of secrecy in this book that didn't necessarily need to be kept secret, and it does really show, however, the massive shame that would have been put on people in Ireland. I don't know if back in the 1970s it would have been such a scandal if a widow and a bachelor had actually gotten together. I do know, however, that there would have been quite a huge scandal if a man who was married had had a baby with another woman and had made his own wife raise that child as their own. I thought that this book was so well written and it was really gripping, engaging, and entertaining. But you do need to have read Brooklyn before you go into this so that you have an idea of who the characters are, so that you have the lay of the land as to what is happening and why this person knows this person and why this is important happening now. Something, however, that I didn't necessarily love is that there are quite a lot of flashbacks in this book and there are a lot of kind of changes in terms of timelines that I didn't feel were particularly well laid out. There were a couple of times that I had to question, when is this action taking place? Where am I supposed to be in the story? What is happening? Why is this important now in this story? I also thought that it was really intriguing that of all of the characters in this book, the only character who is specifically referred to as their full name most of the time is Jim Farrell. I thought it was kind of giving him a status, whether that was a social status or whether it was any other kind of a thing. It kind of set him apart for the rest of the characters in the book in a way that I don't necessarily know if I can explain. I listened to the audiobook of this. It was narrated by Jessie Buckley and I had a great time with it except for one thing. She did mispronounce quite a lot of the town names in Ireland. She kept calling it Curraclough instead of Curracloe, which is a very famous beach in Wexford. It was actually one of the filming locations for Saving Private Ryan. So I just thought that that was one thing that should definitely have been taken care of. Overall, I had a really good time with this book. It is the second of Colm Tóibín books that I've ever read, and I'm definitely going to go back and have a look at his back catalogue and figure out a couple of others, because I know that there is an Easter egg for Nora Webster in this book, and I have a feeling that that means that's the next book I should go on to. Coincidentally and completely unplanned, I started the month and ended the month with books by the exact same author. The last book that I read in July was Love Story by Lindsay Kelk. As you can tell from the title, this is quite heavily Taylor Swift coded. This book follows Sophie Taylor, who works during the day as a primary school teacher, but at night she has a complete other personality that nobody in her life except for one person knows about. Sophie is the mastermind behind S.T. Cox, who is a best-selling romance author. The book that she has just written, Butterflies, has absolutely flown off the shelves. It's been translated into over 30 languages. There are film rights being sold, but nobody knows who the author is. They only know that this is one of the best books that they've read in a really long time and they need more. Sophie is at present working on a sequel to Butterflies, and things start to get a little bit out of hand when she loses the manuscript one day while she's on the way to her parents' house. Her parents are hosting a massive party for her father's birthday. I think he's either 75 or 80. It's definitely a really big deal in the family. And Sophie's not particularly looking forward to it because her parents are really big in the publishing industry and they really look down on romance books. They used to work in really hard-hitting literary fiction, so anything that is just chick lit is a no-go area for them. For this reason, Sophie has never told her family what it is that she does. Sophie is reunited with her manuscript when Joe turns up at the family's party. It turns out that he is the nephew of one of her father's close friends, but Sophie and Joe have already met each other and they instantly clashed heads. Joe also works as the creative director at the publisher of Sophie's book, and he is instantly antagonistic towards her about not knowing who S.G. Cox is, but thinking that he's got it figured out. When they do eventually figure out, their secret is almost scuppered again by Sophie's younger sister Charlotte. And this is where the book really started to unravel for me. I found Charlotte to be one of the most unpleasant characters I have ever read. She is the exact epitome of a trust fund baby who is handed everything that they want in life. Charlotte is 18 years old. I think she is an influencer on TikTok, and she has been shouting about butterflies from the rooftops for weeks. Charlotte also decides that she is not going to go to university. She's going to take a gap year and run her own bookshop in the town for a couple of years and see how that's going to go for her, just as a kind of an idea. What happens is that her parents rent out a space for her to fill up with all of these bookish desires in her head. I just could not stand Charlotte. She was so bratty. She was so materialistic. I can't remember what the exact term is when you make back the money of your advancement. But when that had happened with Sophie and with Butterfly, Sophie treated herself to a £4,000 Chanel handbag. As soon as Charlotte saw that bag, she instantly wanted it. But when she was told she couldn't have it, she just went, oh yeah, I know it's a fake anyway, so it doesn't particularly matter. And then their parents just step in and tell Sophie to just give her sister the handbag for a silent life. I could not stand Charlotte. I found her passages in the book to be so utterly unenjoyable that I just kept speeding through them without even wanting to get to them. There is, however, a kind of a relationship that builds between Sophie and Joe. It's very insta-lovey though. The second that they lay eyes on each other, Sophie decides that this is the man for her. She has the hots for him pretty much instantly, even though she doesn't particularly enjoy his company. She doesn't really like him as a person. And I am not a big insta-love fan. I need to see a relationship and I need to see feelings develop a little bit more naturally than they did in this book. And that just wasn't the vibe that I got here. There were, however, two very big bugbears in this book. As you can tell, this is quite a love story to romance books, to chick lit, to women's fiction, and a kind of a kick up the hole to the naysayers who say that those genres have absolutely no substance and are of absolutely no importance in the world. I really enjoyed that aspect of it, but I do also feel like there were far too many pop culture references in this book. There was a lot of references to TikTok. There were a lot of references to other books and to other authors. And I feel like things like this, if they're not done naturally, are just going to date a book a lot quicker than you would want it to. Because there were so many of them and it was done in a rather unnatural way, it dates this book a lot quicker than I think was intended. Something else that I didn't really understand about this book is when the book is apparently so spicy that you don't even want people to know that you've written it, not to mention that you don't want to know people are reading it, the relationship in this book is actually rather closed door. Okay, it's a little bit more open door than other Lindsay Kelk books have been, but it's not fully doors open, come in and watch what's happening. It's more so the door is open, just a little creak, and you can like peek around and see what's going on, but we'd really rather it if you didn't do that. I felt like that massive juxtaposition in the spiciest book that's ever been written, and I mean, it's okay if you watch, but we'd rather you didn't. It just felt really jarring for me, and it took me out of the book quite a lot. The two books that I have read by Lindsay Kelk in the last month have kind of made me reevaluate my relationship with her. I used to think of Lindsay Kelk as an absolute must-have auto-buy author. Now I'm not entirely so sure if she's going to be still on the auto-buy authors list. Maybe it's an author that I will just pick a book up from if I feel like I need something that's going to keep me going throughout a month. If I'm in a bit of a reading slump, it'll bring me back from it. But I do think she has fallen off of the throne a little bit. That was how my reading month fared in July. How was your reading month, and how many books did you get read in July? If you'd love to leave me a comment but you can't think of anything you'd like to say, then just leave me the sunshine emoji. Don't forget to like and subscribe because I have new videos up every week. Now, get on out of here.